Well, it's very unstable. We are in one-person rule in the United States. Our government is right now ruled by executive decree. This means that one person calls the shots. We don't have legislation. We don't have Congress. Even when courts make decisions, the White House ignores those court decisions for the moment. So this is a very unusual time for the United States. We have a constitution, and that generally governs how we rule. But President Trump is claiming emergency powers all over the place. It's notable that all those tariffs that were put on, then taken off, then put back on, then postponed, all of that is by decree, not by legislation, not by a vote of Congress. So this is the most particular feature of the current scene, and it's quite unusual, and it means that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty and instability.
Right. Let's start a conversation with tariffs. That's something everyone has been talking about, and I want to talk about the repercussions of it, what it means for the world. But let's start from the American voter. How much merit is in Trump's claim when he says tariffs could replace income tax?
Well, quantitatively, this makes no sense at all. Our budget deficit is around 7% of gross domestic product, and the tariffs maybe could collect 1% of GDP. Quantitatively, this is wrong. And if they did collect 1% of GDP, it would be very disruptive indeed. So I think that the idea of tariffs as being the great revenue source for closing this enormous $2 trillion budget deficit that the United States has is just simply fatuous.
And also how tariffs work, isn't it true that there's a high chance the American voters themselves will have to face the brunt of it?
Of course, tariffs will disrupt the value chains that produce goods and services that people need and want. And we know that the tariffs that have been imposed would raise substantially consumer costs for many different areas of the economy. And one by one, Trump postponed or eliminated or offset or gave an exemption for those areas that there was backlash. He ended up postponing almost everything in the end. In other words, this is not a policy that's thought out. It's not a policy that has broad support. It's not a policy that's going to raise living standards. So this is why it's also itself so erratic, because it doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, you improvise.
Also, something interesting is happening in Chinese social media. I don't know if the Trump administration saw it coming, but after the tariffs it has levied against China, the local manufacturers who have been working closely with some of the big American companies have been going on TikTok and other social media platforms to, in a way, sway the American voters in calling for them to buy goods at a much cheaper rate directly from them. What do you make? How do you make sense of this?
Well, I'm not an expert in Chinese social media, so I don't know what the messages are exactly. But I'd say on the broader point, what Trump has done in a very short period of time is really broken relations between the two leading trade economies, the United States and China. The repercussions of that are extremely serious, mostly for the United States, by the way. The U.S. depends on China in many ways, both for the goods that it buys from China, the supply chains, the rare earth, the minerals that the U.S. and others get from China, and from China's holdings and buying of U.S. Treasury notes, because remember, the United States has to fund a huge deficit day after day, month after month. And we've already seen that the financial markets are deeply dislocated by all of this. In other words, I have yet to see a single positive feature of any of this instability of recent weeks.
Professor Sachs, Trump has been justifying his tariff policy under the pretext that the US's friends as well as foes have been mooching off for decades. Now, as you also correctly pointed out, there are trade deficits. But I'm wondering, isn't this also a system that not only Washington has created over the years, but also benefited from it? So isn't it hypocritical that the US now wakes up and wants to upend the entire trade system?
I think the most basic point is a very simple one. A trade deficit does not mean that someone is cheating you. A trade deficit of the United States simply means that the United States spends more than it earns. That's all it means. It means that Americans buy a lot. One reason they buy a lot is that the government is our credit card. The government borrows for the country, it borrows heavily, and then it makes transfer payments to businesses and to households of various kinds. And that means income or that means spending, I should say, that is basically spending on the basis of a debt. And so this is all the trade deficits mean. For Trump to say that the US trade deficit is because the US is being cheated is like someone going out and shopping and buying something on a loan and then accusing the shop that sold them that of cheating them. No, this is what it means to borrow from others. And the United States has been borrowing from others for many decades now. The US doesn't like to tax. The rich donors that pay for the US Congress want to keep their taxes down. So the government runs a chronic deficit. So the country as a whole spends more than it earns. And we have trade deficits, which Trump then blames on foreigners. So you couldn't make this up. It's so bizarre and absurd, but that's actually what is happening right now. There is no justification whatsoever at all to the claim that because the United States is running a trade deficit, other countries are cheating the United States.
Do you think China is going to be the winner in Trump's trade war?
There really aren't winners in trade wars. Trade is a mutually beneficial activity. That's the whole idea. Maybe this is not something understood in Mr. Trump's mind, that you could have things that benefit both sides, because he thinks in terms of win-lose, who's he going to crush, how's the United States going to come out on top. When you disrupt trade, you have losses all over the place. And Trump's actions have disrupted the world trade system. We don't know yet the consequences, because all of the instability of policy means we have no idea what the policy actually is going to land on. But I wouldn't say that China will win, but I would say that the United States will be the number one loser. This is for sure, because these are policies by the United States, and they are isolating the U.S. economy. They're raising the prices of U.S. goods. They're making U.S. manufacturing less efficient, because if you don't buy inputs from abroad at the lowest cost, how can those companies be competitive exporters in world markets? The answer is they can't. So the big loser definitely is the United States, but I'd say everyone else loses something in this as well by all of this disruption.
Let me reframe then. What I was trying to say is that aren't the other countries now looking at the other giant like China and Russia for fending off from what they are seeing in a sort of mistrust when it comes to the relationships with the US? Are they looking away now?
What Trump is trying to do is to say, you make a deal with us and you cut out China. If countries fall into that trap, I think there will be increasing danger for the entire world because we will enter a downward spiral of the trading system itself. If instead countries, governments say, look, the United States is making a mistake, it's isolating itself, but we continue the open trading system with each other, with the rest of the world, this would be the thing that spares the rest of the world a disaster. So the question now is, first, will Trump maintain these tariffs? Will the US courts declare them illegal? Because in my view, they are illegal. They're based on a phony declaration of emergency. But if they do stick, will other countries retaliate against each other? Will they introduce new trade barriers against each other at the behest of the United States? Trump is actually asking India or Europe or others, oh, you should punish China. If we go down that road at the behest of this absolutely damaging U.S. policy, well, then the U.S. will succeed, in quotation marks, in wrecking the whole world. If the rest of the world takes a deep breath and says, we don't want to go there, we know that the open trading system is mutually beneficial, then it will be the U.S. that bears the brunt of the costs, and the rest of the world will be spared the brunt of the costs.
All right, sir, let's shift focus now. You have been a student as well as a professor at Harvard University. What do you make of the university's standoff with the government right now?
The United States is, again, the Trump administration is attacking the universities. Partly it's a kind of cultural revolution that bringing an attack against so-called elite institutions somehow riles a populist base. So it's partly that. It's said to be on the basis of anti-Semitism in these institutions. That is both a laughable and a tragic claim. These are not anti-Semitic institutions at all. The whole idea is completely absurd. Partly it's at the claim that those who protest against Israel's violence and war crimes in Gaza are somehow against American foreign policy. This too is absolutely absurd and tragic. First, we have the right of free speech in the United States under the US Constitution. And second, substantively, protesting against Israel's war crimes is meritorious. It's not some kind of deficiency or something that needs an excuse. It's meritorious because Israel is engaged in absolutely horrendous war crimes. And so when you add it all up, the attack on the universities is dreadful. It is self-destructive of the United States because a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our science and technology come out of these institutions. We are in what I compare to China's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was a disastrous period for China, where the universities were closed down, the economy was in turmoil. And this is what the U.S. is, the Trump administration seems to be promoting right now, that kind of cultural revolution. You asked me about Harvard's stand, saying, no, we won't do that. Of course, this is the correct position. It's other universities have basically given in for the moment to the administration's threats. But Harvard says, no, we're not going to destroy our institution, which, by the way, in the case of Harvard, was founded in 1636. So we're nearing the 400th anniversary of the institution. It's a lot longer lived than the Trump administration and even the United States government.
Right. You mentioned foreign policy. I had spoken to Ambassador John Bolton recently, a man who once was the national security advisor to President Trump and now practically disagrees with almost every single policy of his. He had said something interesting about Trump, that the president views ties with other countries through the lens of personal relations. So if he thinks that he is good friends with Russian President Vladimir Putin, then in his mind, US has good relations with Russia. What do you make of that?
I'm not a huge fan of Ambassador Bolton, first of all. So, in his own
I'm aware.
memoirs, in his own memoirs, he talks about how he tricked Trump in one way or another, that he tried to manipulate Trump. So, I also don't approve of that kind of behavior. What I would say is that the Trump foreign policy is all over the map. On the one side, he's trying to end the war in Ukraine, and I support Trump for that. He's also entered into negotiations with Iran, and I also view that as highly desirable and meritorious, because remember that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu wants the United States to go to war with Iran, which would be absolutely mindless and destructive. At the same time, Trump has basically given a green light to Israel's violence and ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and I find that abhorrent. Also, Trump has abandoned many of the global UN processes, which I believe are central for human well-being. The fight against climate change. Trump is not only denouncing and absenting the United States, but now attacking institutions that are trying to head off the worst of climate change. And India, of course, is going to be one of the great victims of the global climate change, given India's climate itself, India's own vulnerabilities. So Trump is no friend to the world on such actions, but there are areas where Trump is doing the right thing and many where he's doing very harmful things.
You know, recently, former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba gave an opinion. In his own words, he said that it was an unpopular one. He said something on the lines of Trump believes he needs Russia and he doesn't need Ukraine. He thinks that Trump is doing it because Trump is not doing it rather because he's an agent of Russia or anything. He sincerely believes in a worldview that is different from Ukraine. And I want to ask you, do you really think that this opinion could be true, that Trump actually believes that it needs Russia and not Ukraine?
Well, Trump said something that is right, which is that this is Biden's war, not his war. He doesn't want it. What's also true is that what Mr. Kuleba and President Zelensky supported was extremely costly for Ukraine. I don't think that this war has done any good for Ukraine. It's been utterly destructive. The big mistake that Ukraine made was abandoning neutrality and aiming to become part of NATO. And to do that on Russia's border was reckless behavior, absolutely dangerous and provocative. And I told the Ukrainians that don't go that route. You will create grave risks for yourself. There's a famous adage of Henry Kissinger, which many people now know. Henry Kissinger said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, to be a friend is fatal. And what he meant by that is when the US tells you something like, oh, why don't you join NATO? This can be fatal to you. The Ukrainians were very naive. Mr. Kuleba is very naive. Mr. Zelensky is very naive. They thought, oh, the US has our back. I tried to tell them for years, if you go down that road, Ukraine will be destroyed. If you stay with neutrality, Ukraine will be safe. Well, they went the way of trying to become part of the U.S. security system. And Russia said, no, we're not having that on our border. And this is the result. So in this sense, I think that Trump's actions are in line with Ukraine's interests and with U.S. interests and with Russia's interests. In other words, ending a war is win-win. It's not a win-lose.
But the terms, don't you think that matters?
Of course, the terms matter. And the terms that Ukraine could have gotten 3 years ago on April 15th, 2022, in the Istanbul process were better terms than they can get now. And the United States talked them out of it, and Zelensky abandoned the negotiations 3 years ago. This is the result of making major, major policy mistakes for one's country. It's terrible. It's tragic. In those 3 years since the Istanbul process, Ukraine has probably lost 1 million soldiers to deaths and serious injuries. It's all tragic because this war could have ended 3 years ago. It could have been avoided altogether.
Right. Professor Sachs, in an earlier speech, you mentioned that the war in Ukraine is just a sideshow and the real conflict is coming in the future with China. Could you explain that?
Oh, I don't view it that way, but that's how Washington views it. So just to be clear, the Ukraine war is anything but a sideshow. It has had terrible damage to Ukraine. It's cost innumerable lives. By the way, it's done incredible damage to the European economy as well. It's not a sideshow, it's an utter tragedy. But there are American leaders, some of whom I regard as utterly wrong-headed in their approach, who say we should close up the Ukraine war so that we prepare for a war with China. Well, again, I believe that there is no case in the world for a U.S. war with China. It would be a grave disaster for the United States and quite possibly for the whole world. And we should do everything to have normal diplomacy. My main view is that the big powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, should take care not to go into conflict with each other. India and China are now engaged in important diplomacy because there has been conflict and there needs to be diplomacy. The United States needs diplomacy with Russia. The United States needs diplomacy with China. The great powers of the world, and I name the four of them right now, need to stay out of each other's conflict zones. They need to stay out of each other's lanes. They need to not cross each other's red lines, because this is a world of nuclear superpowers that can do not only irreparable, irreversible damage, can end humanity by missteps. And so we need to have, first and foremost, some respect among the major powers for each other, that they are not getting into open conflict.